The atmosphere of Oros V tasted like a rusted blade. Varkas adjusted his atmospheric filters, feeling the heavy oxygen mixture burn against his secondary respiratory slits. The gravity here was a relentless hand, pressing down on his four muscular arms and making every step across the jagged crimson plateau a calculated effort. Behind him, 7 of his finest trackers moved in a diamond formation, their scales shimmering with a dull metallic sheen as they adapted to the planet's harsh radiation. "Status, Tharn," Varkas barked, his voice distorted by the comlink. "Target is 300 meters north, Captain," Tharn replied, checking a handheld bioscanner. "She is stationary near the Obsidian Ridge. Biological readings are consistent with a standard Terran female. 62 kilograms. No armor, no energy signatures. She is a soft shell, Captain. Barely worth the fuel we spent landing here." Varkas clicked his mandibles in a gesture of dismissive amusement. "The rarity makes the price, Tharn. The core systems have a fetish for Earthlings lately. They find their fragile biology fascinating. A live specimen, undamaged and terrified, will fetch enough credits to buy us a new frigate. Maintain the dampening field. I want her cut off from the stars before she even knows she is prey." They moved with the predatory silence of a species that had evolved in the lightless jungles of Kovacs Prime. The terrain of Oros V was a nightmare of sharp edges and shifting dust, but the hunters were professional. They circled the ridge, utilizing the massive rock formations to obscure their approach. As they crested the final rise, Varkas saw her. The human was small, standing barely 170 centimeters tall. She wore a simple dust-stained jumpsuit that offered zero protection against the elements or weaponry. Her dark hair was tied back, and she was kneeling beside a pool of liquid mercury, carefully placing mineral samples into a pack. She looked utterly out of place, a delicate speck of life in a world of violent geology. To Varkas, she looked like a statue of brittle glass, waiting to be shattered. "Close the loop," Varkas ordered. The 7 hunters fanned out, their plasma rifles held at low ready. They moved with the terrifying efficiency of a closing trap. When Varkas finally stepped into the open, his shadow falling across the mercury pool, the human looked up. Her eyes were wide, forward-facing predator eyes, but they lacked the sharp focus of a killer. She stared at Varkas, then at the circle of armed aliens surrounding her. For a heartbeat, there was silence, save for the howling wind of Oros V. "Check out the look on it," Tharn chuckled over the open channel. "She is processing the fact that her life just ended. Look at those thin limbs. One squeeze and she snaps like a twig." Varkas stepped forward, looming over her. He stood over 2 meters tall, a mountain of scales and muscle. "You are coming with us, little thing," he said in Galactic common, his voice a low growl. He didn't expect her to understand, but he enjoyed the theater of it. The human did not move. She did not plead. She didn't even try to run. Instead, she took a deep breath, her chest expanding in a way that seemed unusually deep for such a small frame. Then she screamed. It was a high, piercing sound that cut through the atmospheric roar. To the Kovacs hunters, it was the most beautiful sound in the galaxy, the sound of pure, unadulterated fear. It was the music of a successful hunt. "Oh, that is precious," shouted Krell, the youngest of the crew, as he doubled over in laughter. "She thinks the rocks are going to save her. Scream louder, soft shell. Maybe the stars will hear you." The crew joined in, a chorus of derisive clicks and whistles. They laughed because they were the apex. They laughed because they were masters of the void, and this tiny creature had nothing but a useless vocalization to defend herself. Varkas reached down with 2 of his primary arms, his claws catching the light as he gripped her shoulders. She went down hard, the reinforced carbon fiber netting launching from Tharn's wrist mount to pin her to the red soil. She struggled, her small hands clawing at the mesh, her breathing coming in ragged, desperate gasps. "Load her into the containment pod," Varkas commanded, ignoring the pathetic sound she was making, "and keep the dampening field at maximum. I don't want a single byte of data leaving this rock." As they dragged her toward the landing craft, Lyra Solis looked back at the mercury pool. Her lips moved, not in a scream this time, but in a rhythmic, silent count. Varkas didn't notice. He was already thinking about the 300,000 credits she would bring on the black market. He didn't know that the scream he had enjoyed so much wasn't a cry for help. It was a calibration. The carrion claw was a vessel built for utility and intimidation. Its corridors were narrow, smelling of recycled air, and the metallic tang of dried blood from 1,000 different species. The trophy room, located at the heart of the ship, was Varkas's pride. It was a cathedral of death, filled with preserved specimens held in stasis fields, creatures that had once been the terrors of their respective worlds, now reduced to ornaments. Inside the primary containment cell, Lyra Solis sat on the cold floor. The blue shimmer of the energy field reflected in her dark eyes. She remained perfectly still, her back against the bulkhead, her knees pulled to her chest. In the observation lounge above the trophy room, the crew was celebrating. Amber liquid flowed from fermentation pods, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted meat. "To the captain!" Tharn roared, raising a glass. "To the easiest payday in the history of the Fringe." "I still can't get over that scream," Krell said, wiping a tear of mirth from his scales. "It was so musical, like a dying bird. Do you think all humans make that sound when they realize they are lunch?" Varkas sat in his command chair, watching the monitor that displayed the interior of Lyra's cell. Something was bothering him. It was a faint itch at the base of his skull, a predator's instinct that hadn't quite settled. "Moxar," Varkas called out to the ship's engineer, "why is the internal sensor array fluctuating?" Moxar, a spindly Kovacs with cybernetic optics, looked up from his console. "Minor interference, Captain. Probably just the ferro dust we picked up from Oros V. The filters are working overtime to scrub the hull. It is nothing to worry about." "And the prisoner?" "Quiet as a grave," Moxar replied. "She hasn't made a sound since we broke orbit. Readings show her heart rate is elevated but stable. Standard stress response for a primitive." Varkas turned back to the screen. Lyra had closed her eyes. Her chest was moving in a slow, deliberate rhythm. It wasn't the erratic breathing of a terrified captive. It was steady. It was timed. "Wait," Varkas leaned forward. "Adjust the audio sensors in the cell. Give me a full-spectrum sweep." Moxar grumbled but complied. "Captain, we are in the middle of a party. Why are we listening to a human breathe?" "Just do it!" The audio feed hissed with static, then settled into a low-frequency hum. At first it sounded like the natural vibration of the ship's engines, but as Moxar filtered out the mechanical noise, a new sound emerged. It wasn't a voice. It was a resonance. It was a deep, subharmonic pulse that seemed to originate from Lyra's very bones. It went thrum, 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 at precisely 3-second intervals. "What in the void is that?" Tharn asked, his laughter dying down as he joined Varkas at the monitor. "It is coming from her chest cavity," Moxar said, his cybernetic eye spinning as he analyzed the data. "But the physics are wrong. A biological entity shouldn't be able to produce a frequency this low without massive internal organs. It is almost as if her skeletal structure is acting as a tuning fork." Suddenly the ship shuddered. It wasn't a violent hit, but a long, groaning vibration that rattled the glasses on the tables and caused the lights to flicker. "Report!" Varkas barked. "Internal systems error," Moxar shouted, his fingers flying across the console. "Navigation is drifting. The gravity generators are spiking. Captain, the ship's hull is vibrating in sympathy with the prisoner's frequency." "That is impossible," Tharn said, his scales turning a pale shade of gray. "We are in deep space. There is nothing to vibrate against." "She isn't using the air," Varkas realized, his heart hammering against his ribs. "She is using the hull itself. She is using the carrion claw as a speaker." He looked at the screen. Lyra Solis opened her eyes. She wasn't looking at the floor anymore. She was looking directly at the camera, and for the first time Varkas saw something that made him feel very, very small. It wasn't terror. It was the calm, patient look of a hunter who had already won. "Moxar, sedate her, now!" Varkas commanded. Moxar hit the controls for the gas emitters, but the system didn't respond. A red error message flashed across every screen on the bridge. "System override. External source identified." "External source?" Tharn whispered. "How? We are 10 light-years from the nearest outpost." "She didn't scream because she was afraid," Varkas said, his voice barely a whisper as the realization hit him like a kinetic slug. She screamed to map the atmosphere. She is vibrating now to map the ship. And if she is the beacon, the ship's proximity alarms erupted in a deafening shriek. On the main viewport, the empty blackness of space began to tear. It wasn't the smooth ripple of a standard jump drive. It was a violent, jagged fracture in reality. One ship emerged, then 10, then 50. They weren't the sleek, elegant vessels of the merchant guilds or the clunky cruisers of the fringe pirates. These were blocky, obsidian black warships, bristling with railgun batteries and launch bays. Each one bore the silver crest of a shield and a spear. Aegis Stellar Coalition, Moxar gasped, his optics failing as the sheer amount of electronic warfare data flooded his sensors. Captain, that is a full expeditionary battle group. They are hailing us. The main screen flickered, bypassing the ship's firewalls as if they didn't exist. A man appeared. He was older, his face a map of scars and military discipline, wearing an admiral's uniform that looked like it had been forged in the heart of a star. "This is Admiral Alaric Solus," the man said, his voice cold enough to freeze the air in the room. "You are in possession of a high-value asset of the Coalition. You have 60 seconds to drop your shields and prepare for a forced boarding. If my daughter is harmed in any way, I will not take prisoners. I will not accept a surrender. I will simply erase your vessel from the annals of history." The Admiral leaned closer to the camera, his eyes burning with a terrifying focused rage. "Your clock is ticking, Kovacs. Make the next minute count." Varkas looked at Lyra on the monitor. She stood up slowly, the blue containment field flickering and dying as her own resonance bypassed the ship's power grid. She brushed a bit of red dust from her jumpsuit and looked up at the ceiling. "Hey, Dad," she whispered, her voice carrying through the ship's intercom system. "Took you long enough. These guys are incredibly boring." Varkas slumped into his chair, his forearms hanging limp. He looked at his trophy room, at the hundreds of lives he had stolen and mounted on his walls. He realized then that he had made the ultimate mistake of a predator. He had assumed that because the lamb was soft, it didn't have a pack. The bridge of the carrion claw was no longer a place of command. It had become a vibrating metal coffin. Varkas gripped the edges of his command chair with all four of his primary claws, his knuckles turning a brittle shade of white. Around him, the air itself seemed to hum with a frequency that made his teeth ache and his scales itch with a phantom fire. The main view screen was a chaotic smear of static and jagged light as the Aegis fleet continued its relentless approach. 52 seconds left on the clock. Moxar screamed, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic thumping that now echoed through every bulkhead. "The ship is dying, Captain. The sub-harmonics are shattering the dampening crystals. We are wide open." Varkas ignored the panic rising in his throat. He stared at the small screen displaying the containment cell. Lyra Solus remained seated, but she had tilted her head back, her throat working in a way that defied biological logic. The thrumming sound was coming from her, amplified by the ship's own structural integrity. It was a language of vibrations, a code written in the very atoms of the ship's hull. "How can a single creature do this?" Varkas growled, more to himself than to his crew. "She has no external tech. We scanned her 3 times. "It is not external," Moxar yelled, slamming his hand against a sparking console. "Look at the bone density scans I pulled from the buffer before the system crashed. Her entire skeletal structure has been laced with a lattice of carbon nanotubes and piezoelectric crystals. She is not just a human, Captain. She is a walking, breathing transmitter. Her bones are the antenna, and her heart is the power source. Every beat of her heart is a pulse of data." Varkas felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. He had spent 40 years hunting the most dangerous species in the explored sectors. He had taken down a Krellian void wasp with nothing but a kinetic blade. He had trapped a phase shifter in the nebulas of Sector 7G. He knew predators. He knew prey. But this was something entirely different. This was a level of integration that turned the very concept of biology into a weapon. "Captain, the Admiral's fleet is launching boarding pods," Tharn reported, his 4 eyes wide with terror. "They are moving at 3/4 thrust. They aren't even slowing down for the docking clamps. They're going to breach the hull." Varkas looked at the clock. 45 seconds. He looked at his crew, 7 hardened trackers who had fought by his side through 100 skirmishes. They were good men, in their own brutal way. They were loyal to the hunt and to the credits. But looking at them now, huddled over failing consoles, they looked small. They looked like insects caught in the path of a tectonic shift. "Move the prisoner to the trophy room," Varkas commanded, his voice regaining some of its steel. "Now!" Tharn hesitated. "Captain, the resonance in there is twice as strong. The specimens are starting to react. I said move her. If they want her back, they'll have to walk through the graveyard I've built. And Tharn, tell Krell to prep the heavy ordnance. If we're going dark, we're taking the big fish with us." As Tharn scrambled to obey, Varkas stood up and pulled a heavy pulse pistol from his belt. He walked toward the elevator, his boots heavy on the vibrating floor. He needed to see her. He needed to understand what kind of species would turn their own children into living beacons. The trophy room was a nightmare of blue stasis fields and shadow. The 100 specimens Varkas had collected over the decades were usually silent, frozen in their final moments of defiance or fear. But now they were moving. The subharmonic frequency Lyra was emitting was bleeding into the stasis fields, disrupting the temporal lock that kept the creatures frozen. A Thorian berserker, a 3-meter wall of muscle and fur, was twitching. Its massive claws scraped against the interior of its glass prison. A crystalline serpent from the moons of Vendax was uncoiling, its scales clicking like 1,000 falling needles. The room was alive with the restless energy of the dead. In the center of it all stood Lyra. Tharn and Krell had her pinned between them, their rifles pressed against her ribs. She didn't look like a prisoner. She looked like a conductor standing in the middle of a symphony. "Stop the noise," Varkas said, stepping into the room. The vibration was so intense here that he could feel his own organs pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Lyra looked at him, and for the first time she spoke without the resonance. Her voice was quiet, steady, and terrifyingly calm. "I'm not making the noise, Captain. I'm just giving the ship a voice. It's been carrying the weight of all these stolen lives for a long time. It has a lot to say." Varkas raised his pistol, pointing it directly at her forehead. "Your father is about to tear my ship apart. Give me one reason why I shouldn't zero you right now and leave him with a corpse to mourn." "Because you're a hunter, Varkas," she said, using his name for the first time. "And a hunter knows when he's been outmatched. You think you captured me because I was weak. You think my father is coming because he's angry. You're wrong on both counts." Varkas narrowed his eyes. "Oh, enlighten me." "My father isn't coming because he's angry," she said, her eyes shifting to the Thorian berserker behind him. "He's coming because it's the law. The Aegis Coalition doesn't leave its people behind. Not because we're sentimental, but because we're a pack. And in a pack, when one of us screams, the whole forest answers." She leaned in, ignoring the rifles at her sides. "You made a mistake when you brought me to this room, Captain. You thought these were trophies. To me, they're just more voices for the choir." Suddenly, the ship was rocked by a massive impact. The sound of tearing metal screamed through the corridors, a jagged, screeching noise that meant a boarding pod had successfully pierced the outer hull. 30 seconds, the Admiral's voice boomed through the ship's intercom, though how he had hijacked the internal speakers was a mystery to Varkas. "I can see you in the trophy room, Varkas. I suggest you put the weapon down." Varkas looked up at the ceiling, his mandibles twitching. "You're a long way from home, Admiral. You think you can just waltz onto a Kovacs vessel and dictate terms? This is my ship. These are my rules." The floor buckled, a second impact, closer this time. Dust and debris rained from the ventilation shafts. Krell, the youngest hunter, began to shake. His rifle wobbled against Lyra's side. "Captain, they're through the secondary bulkhead," Krell shouted, his voice cracking. "There are dozens of them. They're wearing heavy void armor. Our plasma rounds are just bouncing off." Varkas looked at Lyra. She was smiling. It wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of pity. "I'm sorry, Varkas," she whispered. "For what? For what happens when the pack finds the cage?" The doors to the trophy room exploded. Not with fire, but with a concentrated burst of sonic energy that sent Tharn and Krell flying across the room. Varkas was thrown back against the stasis chamber of the crystalline serpent, his pistol clattering to the floor. Through the smoke stepped 4 figures. They were massive, encased in matte black power armor that seemed to swallow the light. Their helmets were faceless visors of glowing orange, and their weapons were short, brutal-looking carbines that hummed with a hungry energy. They didn't fire. They didn't shout. They simply moved with a synchronized grace that made the Kovacs hunters look like clumsy children. They formed a perimeter around Lyra in 3 seconds flat. One of the soldiers, his armor marked with the stripes of a sergeant, reached out and touched the control panel of Lyra's containment field. The blue shimmer vanished. "Report, Lieutenant Solis," the sergeant said, his voice a gravelly rumble through his helmet's external speakers. "I'm green, Sergeant Powell," Lyra said, stretching her arms. "But the captain here has a collection that needs documenting. High-level sentient trafficking, multiple endangered species in illegal stasis." "Understood," Powell said. He turned his visor toward Varkas, who was struggling to stand. "Captain Varkas, you are currently in violation of the Interstellar Sentient Rights Act, Section 14. By authority of the Aegis Stellar Coalition, I am placing this vessel under military seizure." Varkas spat a glob of purple ichor onto the floor. "You're on the edge of the fringe, human. Your laws don't reach this far." The sergeant stepped forward, his massive armored boot cracking the floor plating. "Our laws reach as far as our people wander, and today they reached you." The sergeant raised his carbine, but he didn't point it at Varkas. He pointed it at the ceiling. "Admiral, the asset is secure. Commencing Phase 2. "Phase 2? Varkas whispered, a cold dread pooling in his gut. From the speakers, the Admiral's voice returned, no longer cold but possessed of a terrifying absolute authority. "Copy that, Sergeant. Open the cages. Let the galaxy see what Captain Varkas has been hiding in the dark." The sound of 100 stasis fields deactivating at once was a low, electrical whine that seemed to suck the air out of the room. Varkas watched in horror as the temporal locks on his life's work began to fail. The creatures he had spent decades tracking, capturing, and preserving were waking up. "This is madness," Varkas screamed, scrambling toward the nearest control terminal. "They'll kill us all. That berserker hasn't fed in 15 years. The serpent will vent the atmosphere." Sergeant Powell didn't move. He stood like a statue of black iron, his carbine held in a relaxed but ready position. "We have medical teams and containment units waiting in the breach, Captain. We aren't just here for the lieutenant. We're here for the whole ledger." Lyra walked over to Varkas, who was frantically punching codes into a dead console. "It's over, Varkas. The ship's AI has been purged. My father's electronic warfare suites didn't just walk through your front door. They rewrote the house." Varkas looked at her, his 4 eyes bloodshot and wide. "Why? All this for one girl? You could have sent a negotiator. You could have paid the ransom. My price was only 500,000 credits. That's nothing to a fleet like this." "It was never about the money," Lyra said, her voice softening as she watched the Thorian berserker slump to the floor of its cage, breathing its first breath of real air in over a decade. "It was about the principle. If we let one person be taken, if we let one human be treated like an animal for display, then the whole structure of our society fails. We don't negotiate with hunters, Varkas. We end the hunt." Behind her, the other armored soldiers were moving through the room, tagging the waking creatures with glowing biotransponders. They worked with a quiet, professional efficiency that was more terrifying to Varkas than any scream. They weren't angry. They were doing a job. Suddenly, a series of muffled explosions echoed from the lower decks. The ship groaned, tilting 10 degrees to the port side. "That would be your engines going dark," Powell said. "My team just applied a localized EMP to your reactor core. You're a drifting rock now, Varkas." "Captain," Tharn's voice came over the comms, high-pitched and hysterical. "The humans. They're everywhere. They aren't even using the doors. They're cutting through the decks. Grix is gone. They just walked over him." Varkas slumped against the glass wall of the crystalline serpent's cage. He looked at his claws, then at the heavy weapons held by the human soldiers. He had always believed that the universe was a place of iron laws. The strong took, and the weak suffered. He had built his entire life on that belief. He was the apex. He was the one who decided who lived in a cage and who stayed behind the glass. But now, looking at the black-armored figures, he realized he had been looking at the wrong map. He had mistaken physical fragility for weakness. He had seen a woman with no claws and no scales and assumed she was prey. He hadn't seen the 10,000 ships behind her. He hadn't seen the centuries of history where her people had fought off things far more terrifying than a Kovacs hunter. Humanity didn't survive Earth because they were the strongest, Lyra said, as if reading his thoughts. We survived because we were the most stubborn. We survived because when the wolves came, we didn't just run. We invited the wolves to our fire and turned them into dogs. And the ones that wouldn't come to the fire, we built better spears. The sergeant's helmet hissed as the seal broke. He pulled it off, revealing a face that looked like it had been carved out of old leather. He was a man of perhaps 50 years with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that were a piercing, unforgiving blue. He looked at Varkas not with hatred, but with a profound, weary disgust. "I've seen your kind in a dozen systems, Varkas," the sergeant said, his voice even rougher without the speakers. "You think you're a big man because you can put a sentient being in a box? You think the void is a lawless place where you can play God?" "I was just doing business," Varkas snarled, a last spark of defiance flickering in his chest. "These species, they aren't like you. They're animals." The sergeant took 2 steps and stood directly in front of Varkas. The human was shorter than the Kovacs, but the sheer weight of his presence seemed to fill the room. He reached out with a gloved hand and pointed to the small reptilian creature Lyra had identified earlier, the Quelix juvenile. "That animal is a third-year student of the Xylos Academy," the sergeant said. "His parents have been looking for him for 3 years. They thought he was lost in a shuttle accident. Instead, he's been sitting here in a temporal lock, watching you eat and sleep while he couldn't even blink." The sergeant's hand tightened into a fist. "You aren't a businessman, Varkas. You're a parasite, and the galaxy is a much smaller place than you thought it was." The Admiral's voice returned, sharp and clear. "Sergeant, enough talk. We have 3 more ships in the sector to intercept. Get the lieutenant and the survivors onto the transport. Prepare the Kovacs crew for processing." "Processing?" Tharn's voice came over the speaker, trembling. "What does that mean? Are you going to kill us?" Admiral Martinez appeared on the main holographic display in the center of the trophy room. He looked at Tharn's trembling form on the bridge cameras, then at Varkas. "We are humans," the Admiral said. "We don't kill unless we have to. You will be taken to a coalition detention center. You will stand trial before a tribunal of the species you have victimized. You will be given a lawyer, you will be given fair treatment, and you will be given a sentence that reflects the scale of your crimes." The Admiral paused, his eyes locking onto Varkas. "But I should warn you, the Quelix are a very patient people. They don't believe in the death penalty. They believe in restoration, which means you will spend the next 60 years of your life working to rebuild the habitats you destroyed. You're going to spend a long, long time being the help, Varkas." Varkas felt the weight of the years crashing down on him. 60 years. By the time he was finished, he would be an old man, his scales dull and his strength gone. Everything he had built, the carrion claw, his reputation, his collection, was gone in less than an hour, all because he had heard a scream and thought it was an invitation. "Wait," Varkas said as the soldiers began to lead him away. "One question." The Admiral looked at him from the hologram. "Make it quick. How did you get here so fast?" Varkas asked, his voice hollow. "We were in a deep space corridor. The nearest Aegis jump point is 3 systems away. Even with a warp drive, it should have taken you days." The Admiral gave a small, grim smile. "We didn't use a warp drive, Varkas. We used a Murphy drive. It doesn't travel through space, it folds probability. As soon as Lyra's signal went live, the probability of us being right on top of you went from 0 to 100%. We were always coming for her, Varkas. From the moment you touched her, your future was written. We just showed up to read the final chapter." Lyra walked past Varkas as the soldiers nudged him toward the breach. She stopped for a moment, looking at the Quelix juvenile, who was now being cradled by a human medic. "You know, Varkas," she said quietly, "there's a word on Earth for what you did today. We call it punching above your weight class. You saw a small girl and thought you were the giant. You forgot that giants don't live alone." As she stepped out of the room, the subharmonic thrumming finally stopped. The ship was silent, save for the sound of human boots and the soft cries of the survivors being freed. Varkas looked back one last time at his trophy room. The cages were empty. The glass was broken. And for the first time in 40 years, he was the one being led into the dark. The boarding pods began to retract, their jagged teeth pulling out of the carrion claw's hull with a sound like a closing tomb. The human fleet, 237 ships strong, began to turn, their engines glowing with a fierce, cold light. They had what they came for. They had corrected the anomaly. In the vacuum of space, the silence returned. But for Varkas, sitting in the back of a black-armored transport, the scream was still echoing. It would stay with him for the next 60 years. A reminder that in a galaxy of monsters, the most dangerous thing you can encounter is a pack that cares. The transition from the carrion claw to the Aegis heavy cruiser, the Indomitable, was like stepping from a gutter into a cathedral. The lighting was warm, the air smelled of ozone and clean linens, and the hum of the ship was a soothing, rhythmic purr that spoke of immense power held in perfect check. Varkas and his remaining crew were marched down the main corridor, their hands bound in high-tensile energy cuffs. Human soldiers lined the halls, their weapons at their sides, their eyes following the Kovacs with a mixture of professional detachment and cold curiosity. "Is this it?" Tharn whispered, his four eyes darting nervously. "Is this where they do the processing?" "Shut up, Tharn," Varkas snapped, though his own heart was hammering. They were led into a large holding bay. But instead of the cages Varkas expected, there were rows of simple, sturdy benches and a long table filled with scanning equipment. A group of humans in white coats, medics, Varkas realized, were moving among the other prisoners, the creatures from Varkas's own trophy room. He saw the Thorian berserker sitting on a massive reinforced platform, a human medic calmly wrapping a thermal bandage around its scarred leg. The beast, which could have crushed the human's skull with a single swipe, sat perfectly still, its amber eyes fixed on the man with a look of confused reverence. They're treating them," Moxar said, his cybernetic eye whirring. "They're treating the specimens like patients." Varkas watched as Lyra Solis walked into the bay. She had changed out of her dusty jumpsuit and into a clean, dark blue uniform. She looked taller now, her posture straight, her expression focused. She walked over to the Quelix juvenile, who was chirping softly as a medic fed it a nutrient paste. "How is he?" she asked. "Dehydrated but stable," the medic replied. "He's been in stasis for 3 years. His muscle atrophy is significant, but he'll recover. We've already contacted his colony. They're sending a long-range courier to meet us at Station Omega 9. "Good," Lyra said. "Make sure he gets a full neurological sweep. The Kovac stasis tech is crude. I want to make sure there's no long-term temporal drift." She turned then and saw Varkas watching her. She didn't look away. She walked over to the processing table, her boots clicking on the polished deck. "You're lucky, Varkas," she said, her voice echoing in the large room. "Lucky?" Varkas spat. "You've destroyed my ship, stolen my livelihood, and you're sending me to a labor camp for 60 years. Where is the luck?" "The luck is that you took a human," she said, leaning against the table. "If you had taken a Vexturi child, their parents would have glassed your homeworld before you reached the first jump point. If you had taken a Kren scout, they would have sent a biological plague through your ventilation system. But you took us." She gestured to the room, to the medics, the soldiers, and the survivors. "We believe in the law, Varkas. We believe that even a parasite like you deserves a chance to see the damage he's done. We aren't going to kill you because we don't want your blood on our hands. We want your sweat on the worlds you tried to break." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You called us prey. You laughed when I screamed. But look around this room. Who is the prey now, Varkas? The ones who are being healed or the ones who are being judged?" Varkas looked around. He saw the survivors, the weak, the small, the fragile, being tended to with a tenderness he didn't know existed in the cold void of space. He saw the power of a species that didn't just hunt, but protected. He saw the strength of a pack that didn't just kill, but restored. He didn't have an answer. For the first time in his life, the great hunter Varkas had nothing to say. The sergeant stepped forward and tapped Varkas on the shoulder. "Time to move, Captain. The Admiral is waiting for the final report, and your transport leaves in 10 minutes. As Varkas was led away, he looked back at Lyra one last time. She was kneeling on the floor, helping the Quelix juvenile stand on its wobbly legs. The small creature reached out a tiny three-fingered hand and touched her cheek. Varkas realized then that he had spent his whole life looking for trophies to hang on a wall. He had looked for things that were beautiful in their death, frozen and silent. He had never understood that the most valuable thing in the galaxy wasn't something you could capture and keep. It was the sound of a scream that brought 1,000 ships. It was the vibration of a heart that refused to beat alone. It was the pack, and it was coming for everyone like him. The Indomitable's engines flared, a brilliant white light that illuminated the dark corner of the Ember Fringe. The fleet began to move, a coordinated dance of steel and light, heading back toward the heart of human space. On the bridge, Admiral Alaric Solis stood at the main viewport, watching the stars blur into the kaleidoscopic tunnel of the Murphy Drive. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Lyra standing beside him. "You okay, kid?" he asked, his voice losing the hard edge of the commander. "I'm fine, Dad," she said, leaning her head against his arm. "Just a little tired. Resonance scouting takes a lot out of the bones." The Admiral sighed, a deep, weary sound. "I told you to take the desk job at the academy. You could be teaching the next generation of scouts in a nice, safe classroom on Earth." Lyra laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the bridge. "And missed the chance to see idiots like Varkas try to figure out how a 62-kilogram human just hacked their ship? Not a chance." The Admiral looked at his daughter, his eyes filled with a pride that no metal could ever match. "You're just like your mother, stubborn as a mule and twice as dangerous." "I'll take that as a compliment," she said. They stood there for a long moment, father and daughter, as the ship folded space and time around them. Behind them in the holding bay, 100 survivors were beginning the long journey home. And in the brig, a group of hunters was beginning to learn that the galaxy was a much, much larger place than they had ever imagined. The hunt was over. The pack was home. And for Lyra Solis, the next scream was just a calibration away. The detention cell aboard the Indomitable was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, precisely because it wasn't a cell at all. It was a room. It had 4 walls of warm, brushed alloy, a bed that adjusted to Kovacs physiology, and a sanitation unit that actually functioned. For Varkas, it was more terrifying than a torture rack. In his world, mercy was a sign of a predator playing with its food, a prolonged cruelty designed to break the spirit before the body. He sat on the edge of the cot, his forearms folded tightly across his chest, his primary claws digging into his own scales. Across from him, Tharn was pacing the 3 meters of floor space like a caged, frantic cat. "They're going to durez us, Varkas," Tharn hissed, his scales a sickly, translucent yellow. "I've heard stories about human trials. They don't just kill you, they take your mind apart. They find every credit you've hidden, every contact you've made in the fringe. We're hull rats now. We're ground meat." "Shut up, Tharn," Varkas growled, though his own voice lacked its usual bite. "They haven't touched us. They gave you a nutrient wash for your scales and a thermal blanket. Stop acting like a whelp." "That's the grift. Don't you see?" Tharn stopped and pointed a trembling claw toward the door. "They're fattening us up. They want us soft. When that sergeant, the one with the leather face, comes back, he's going to peel us like fruit. I'm telling you, I'm ready to talk. I'll give them the coordinates for the Black Sun Syndicate. I'll give them the codes to your offshore marks. I'm not dying for a trophy room that's already been scrapped." Varkas stood up, his massive frame looming over his second-in-command. Even in a human jumpsuit, he was a mountain of muscle. "You will hold your tongue, or I will rip it out and feed it to you. We are Kovacs. We don't roll for ground pounders." The door hissed open, sliding into the bulkhead with a whisper of magnetic coils. Varkas tensed, expecting the sergeant in a squad of Marines. Instead, it was Lyra Solis. She looked different. The clean uniform she had worn earlier was gone, replaced by a loose gray medical tunic. Her face was unnaturally pale, and there were dark, bruised circles beneath her eyes. She moved with a slight limp, leaning against the doorframe for a moment before stepping inside. She wasn't carrying a weapon, and she was alone. "You look like hell," Varkas said, his mandibles clicking involuntarily. Resonance scouting isn't exactly a spot day, Lyra replied, her voice raspy. She sat on the small table bolted to the floor, her movements slow and deliberate. Vibrating your own skeletal structure to the point of structural failure tends to leave a few marks. I've got hairline fractures in 32 places and a persistent hum in my ears that the docs say might never go away. Varkas stared at her. You did that to yourself? Voluntarily? It's the job, she said, shrugging, though the motion clearly pained her. The Aegis Coalition doesn't just hand out power armor and Murphy drives. You have to earn the right to be a beacon. It's a choice we make. A stupid choice, Tharn spat, his fear turning into a defensive sneer. You broke your own bones to call a fleet? You're just a broken tool now, a discarded piece of tech. Lyra looked at Tharn, her eyes cool and clinical. Is that how you see your crew, Tharn? Tools? When Grix was KIA during the boarding, did you even stop to retrieve his biotags? Or did you just calculate the fuel you'd save without his weight on the ship? Tharn flinched, his scales rippling. He knew the risks. He was a professional. He was a father, Lyra countered, her voice sharpening. We recovered his personal effects. He had a data slate with 300 hours of recorded stories for a hatchling back on Kovacs Prime. A hatchling that's never going to hear them now because you were too busy trying to figure out how to jump to light speed while your ship was being breached. She turned back to Varkas. My father wants to see you, not as a prisoner, but as a witness. There's a situation in the medbay. A situation? Varkas asked, his predator instincts sparking. One of your trophies isn't responding to the stabilization field, Lyra said, standing up with visible effort. The Thorian Berserker. He's going into a predatory fugue. The trauma of the stasis and the resonance has triggered something in his limbic system. He's tearing the containment unit apart. The Marines want to put him down. My father, he wants to save him. But we don't know the specific sedative mix you used to keep him under for 15 years. Varkas laughed, a dry, rasping sound. You want my help? The Great Aegis Coalition, with their warships and their folding space, can't handle one overgrown furball? We can handle him, Lyra said, stepping closer. Her voice was quiet now, devoid of the earlier sarcasm. Handling him means shooting him with a railgun at point-blank range? It means another death in a room already full of them. I thought you might want to prevent that. Not for us. For him. Why should I care? Varkas asked. The beast is a killer. It's killed dozens of my kind. Because you spent 15 years watching him, Lyra said. You fed him through a tube. You brushed his fur to keep the stasis mold from growing. You treated him like a masterpiece because he was the only thing in the universe that was as lonely as you are. Don't lie to me, Varkas. I saw the way you looked at his cage when the power went out. You weren't afraid of him. You were afraid for him. Varkas felt a strange, hot pressure behind his eyes. He hated her in that moment. He hated the way she could see through the armor and the scales. He hated that she was right. 10 minutes, Varkas said, standing up. I need 10 minutes with my chemical logs. If you've erased them, the beast is as good as dead. We didn't erase them, Lyra said, gesturing toward the door. We just couldn't translate the Kovacs slang for the catalyst. Void spit and black lung aren't in the medical dictionary. Honoré, as they walked down the corridor, the humanistic theme Varkas had spent his life mocking began to press in on him. He saw soldiers sharing rations with freed slaves. He saw engineers working side by side with reptilian technicians to repair a malfunctioning life support unit. There was no hierarchy of strength here, only a frantic, messy web of cooperation. It was a test, not of his strength, but of his fundamental belief system. If he helped, he was admitting that the pack was right. If he refused, he was letting the one thing he respected in the galaxy die. They reached the medbay, and the sound hit them immediately. It was a roar that vibrated the very floor, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. The Thorian Berserker was a mass of white fur and muscle, throwing itself against a shimmering energy barrier. Blood, thick and black, smeared the glass. Admiral Alaric Solus stood near the barrier, his face grim. He didn't look like a conqueror now. He looked like a man watching a house burn down. Captain Varkas, the Admiral said, not turning his head. My daughter says you have the recipe. My Marines are on a 5-minute countdown to terminate. Make your choice." Varkas looked at the berserker. The creature's eyes were bloodshot, rolling in its head as it searched for an enemy it couldn't see. Varkas knew that roar. It wasn't a battle cry. It was the scream of someone who had woken up in a nightmare and realized they were still alone. "I need 2 liters of concentrated neurotoxin, 3 units of synthetic adrenaline, and a heavy-duty aerosolizer," Varkas barked, his voice commanding for the first time since his capture. "And move your men back. The scent of human sweat is a trigger for Thorians. If you want him to sleep, stop smelling like a target." The Admiral nodded once. "Give him what he needs. And Sergeant, put the railguns on safety, for now." Varkas stepped up to the terminal, his forearms moving across the human interface with a clumsy but determined speed. He was a hunter again, but the goal wasn't a trophy. It was a life. And as he worked, he realized with a jolt of terror that he actually cared if he succeeded. The chemical cocktail hissed through the ventilation of the containment unit, a fine blue mist that settled over the white fur of the Thorian berserker. The creature's roars slowed, turning into deep, shuddering groans. Its massive claws, capable of rending reinforced steel, slipped against the floor. Slowly, the mountain of muscle collapsed, the beast breathing, evening out into a heavy, drug-induced slumber. Silence returned to the medbay, heavy and thick with the smell of ozone and medicinal chemicals. "He's down," Varkas said, his primary arms falling to his sides. He felt an exhaustion he couldn't explain, a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with gravity. "Good work, Captain," Admiral Solis said. He stepped toward Varkas, his expression unreadable. "You saved a life today, one that had no value to you. Why?" Varkas turned, his mandibles tight. "Because the beast is a better warrior than any of you. To let it die at the hands of a railgun while it was drugged and confused, that would be an insult to the hunt." "Is that what you tell yourself?" Lyra asked. She had been leaning against a nearby pillar, her face even paler than before. She suddenly swayed, her eyes fluttering. "Lyra!" the Admiral shouted, moving with a speed that belied his age. He caught her before she hit the deck, lowering her gently. "Medic!" a soldier yelled, and within seconds a team was swarming around her. Varkas stood back, watched by 2 armed guards. He saw the Admiral's hand trembling as he brushed a lock of hair from his daughter's forehead. It was the same look Varkas had seen on 100 species, the look of a father who would burn the galaxy to cinders to keep his child safe. But there was something else there too, a deep, abiding guilt. "The resonance," Varkas whispered. "It's not just the bones, is it?" The Admiral looked up, his eyes hard and cold. "No, it's the nervous system. Every time she acts as a beacon, she burns out a little more of her neural pathways. It's a temporary fix, Varkas. The crystals in her bones grow. They ossify. Eventually, she won't be able to move. She won't be able to speak. She'll just be a statue." Varkas felt a sickening lurch in his gut. "You knew this? You let her do this to herself?" "She chose this," the Admiral said, his voice a low growl of pain. "We all choose. I gave up my right to a peaceful life 30 years ago. Sergeant Powell gave up his left arm and half his face. We do it so that others don't have to. That is the pact, Varkas. It isn't just about protection. It's about the price we pay for it." This was the turning point, the moment where the peeling layers finally reached the core. Varkas had spent his life thinking that the humans were strong because of their ships, their guns, and their numbers. He had thought they were lucky. He realized now that they were terrifying because they were willing to suffer. They were a species of voluntary martyrs, people who broke their own bodies to ensure that a single lost soul could find their way home. It wasn't strength. It was a beautiful, horrific madness. "She needs a neural dampener," Varkas said suddenly. The medics looked at him surprised. The Admiral narrowed his eyes. "What did you say?" "The Kovacs. We have a technology for our elite trackers. When we stay in the deep void for too long, our brains begin to oscillate with the ship's drive. We use a localized magnetic field to stabilize the synapses. It won't heal her, but it will stop the crystals from growing for a while. It will give her time. We've tried magnetic stabilization," a human medic said dismissively. "The human brain is too sensitive to the flux." "Not if you use a triple-phase harmonic," Varkas countered, stepping forward despite the guard's weapons. "You're using a static field. You need a pulse. like a heartbeat. I have the schematics on my ship. In the secondary locker, it's labeled Sector 9 Alpha. The Admiral stared at Varkas for a long, agonizing minute. He was looking for the trick, the hidden trap, the poison in the medicine. But Varkas didn't blink. He stood his ground, forearms open, palms visible, the Kovacs gesture of total transparency. Go, the Admiral told the sergeant. Take a team to the wreckage of the Carrion Claw. Find that locker. If he's lying, Sergeant, you have my permission to eject him into the vacuum. I'm not lying, Varkas said, his voice hollow. I want her to live. I want to see how this ends. Hours passed. Lyra was moved to a high-intensity recovery ward. Varkas was taken back to his cell, but this time, he wasn't alone. Tharn was gone, moved to a different sector after he had tried to trade Varkas's life for a lighter sentence. Varkas sat in the silence, watching the stars drift past the small porthole. He thought about his collection. He thought about the 60 years ahead of him. For the first time, the idea of reconstruction didn't feel like a death sentence. It felt like a penance. The door opened. It was Sergeant Powell. He looked tired, his one good eye bloodshot. He was carrying a small silver device, the Kovacs neural dampener. It worked, Powell said. Her reading stabilized within 20 minutes of the first pulse. She's sleeping. The doctors say the ossification has stopped. Varkas nodded, a slow, heavy movement. She is a strong warrior, even for a soft shell. Powell stepped into the cell and sat on the edge of the table. He pulled a small flask from his armor and offered it to Varkas. It's Kren brandy, strong enough to strip the paint off a frigate. You want a hit? Varkas took the flask, the liquid burning like liquid fire as it hit his throat. Why are you showing me this? You should be celebrating. You won. Nobody wins in the black, Varkas, Powell said, taking the flask back. We just survive. You did something today that didn't benefit you. You gave up a secret of your people to save a girl who put you in chains. Why? Varkas looked at his claws. Because I heard her scream, Sergeant, and for 40 years I thought I was the only one who knew what it meant to be alone in the dark. She showed me that I was wrong. She showed me that the dark is only empty if you let it be. Welcome to the pack, Captain, Powell said, a grim smile touching his scarred lips. It's a hell of a lot of work, and the pay is garbage, but you'll never have to scream alone again. As the sergeant left, Varkas looked out at the fleet. Hundreds of ships, thousands of lives, all moving in perfect, synchronized harmony. He realized then that the biggest mistake he had made wasn't kidnapping an admiral's daughter. It was thinking that weakness was a lack of claws. The real weakness was thinking you could survive the universe without anyone to hear you when you cried out. In the recovery ward, Lyra Solis opened her eyes. The hum in her ears was gone, replaced by a soft, rhythmic thrumming against her temple. She felt the cool metal of the Kovacs device, pulsing like a second heart. She saw her father sitting by her bed, his head bowed in sleep. She saw the guards at the door, their visors dark, their posture alert. And through the window she saw the silhouette of the Carrion Claw, being towed by a human salvage vessel. She smiled, a small pain thing. She closed her eyes and focused on the vibration of the ship. She could feel every engine, every bulkhead, every person aboard the Indomitable. They were all there, a vast, complex symphony of life. She wasn't a statue, not yet. She had time, and as she drifted back into a dreamless sleep, she sent one final pulse through the neural dampener, a small, silent thank you that traveled through the ship's hull, through the decks, and into the cell where a four-armed hunter sat watching the stars. Varkas felt it, a tiny tremor in the floorboards, a resonance he finally knew how to read. He didn't click his mandibles, he didn't growl, he simply leaned his head against the alloy wall, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the weight of the gravity. The transition out of probability space was never supposed to feel like being kicked in the ribs by a Thorian berserker, but as the Indomitable shuddered under a sudden, violent impact, Varkas was thrown from his cot and slammed against the far wall of his cell. The red emergency lights didn't just flicker. They died, replaced by the harsh, staccato pulse of a ship under direct assault. "Report!" Varkas bellowed, his forearms scrambling for purchase against the vibrating alloy, momentarily forgetting that he was a prisoner and not a captain. The only answer was the deep, resonant groan of the hull. It was a sound he knew well, the shriek of a magnetic grappling line biting into the ship's skin. Someone was not just shooting at the Aegis cruiser, they were trying to reel it in. The cell door didn't slide open this time. It was blown off its maglocks by a localized thermal charge. Sergeant Powell stumbled through the smoke, his black power armor scorched and pitted. He wasn't carrying a nutrient flask or a medical report. He was carrying a standard-issue human pulse carbine, and he tossed a secondary sidearm, a heavy Kovacs-patterned kinetic pistol, onto Varkas's cot. "Pick it up, Captain," Powell rasped, his voice tight with the strain of a man who had been fighting for 3 hours straight in the lower decks. The situation just went from sideways to total duress. Varkas stared at the weapon. It was his own pistol, the one the humans had confiscated after the breach of the carrion claw. "The Black Sun?" "Worse," Powell said, checking the power cell in his carbine. "It's the Ravagers. The Syndicate sent their cleanup crew. They don't want the credits anymore, Varkas. They want to glass this entire sector to make sure the Aegis Coalition doesn't find their breeding pits on Kepler. They've brought a scavenger dreadnought. It's sitting 2 kilometers off our stern, and they've already put boarding teams into the med bay and the engine room." Varkas stood up, his height filling the small room. He gripped the pistol, the familiar weight of the grip sending a surge of old adrenaline through his primary arms. "You're arming me? I could put a slug through your skull right now and take a lifeboat." Powell looked him dead in his 4 eyes, his own blue gaze hard as frozen nitrogen. "You could, but the Ravagers don't take prisoners, and they certainly don't care about Kovacs hunting traditions. To them, you're just another 60 kilograms of carbon to be recycled. Besides, my daughter's in that med bay." Varkas paused. "Your daughter? I thought Lyra was the Admiral's child." "She is," Powell said, a grim, bloody smile touching his lips. "But in the pack, Varkas, we don't differentiate. Every kid on this ship belongs to all of us. Now, are you going to help me protect the nursery, or are you going to sit here and wait for the void to take you?" Varkas didn't answer with words. He checked the slide of the kinetic pistol, holstered it in his jumpsuit, and stepped into the corridor. The ship was a charnel house of blue and red light. Human Marines were entrenched at every junction, firing into the darkness of the service tunnels where the Ravagers, degenerate, cybernetically enhanced scavengers from a dozen different species, were pouring through the breaches. "The med bay is 2 decks up," Varkas said, his predator mind instantly mapping the ship's interior. "If they've breached the secondary hull, they'll be coming through the ventilation shafts. Your men are focusing on the corridors. You're leaving your throat wide open." "Lead the way, Captain," Powell said, gesturing with his carbine. "And watch the corners. These guys use shriek nades, sonic distractors that'll scramble your internal equilibrium." As they moved through the ship, Varkas saw the cost of the humanistic theme he had once mocked. He saw a young Marine, no more than 19 years old, using his own body to shield a group of terrified Queelix survivors as a Ravager boarding pod crashed through the bulkhead. The boy didn't survive the first volley of plasma, but the survivors scrambled into the service crawl space he had defended. It was a waste of resources, a tactical error. And yet, as Varkas saw the grief and the renewed fury in the eyes of the other Marines, he realized it was also a force multiplier. They weren't fighting for territory or credits. They were fighting for the people behind them. They reached the med bay just as the heavy blast doors began to buckle under the heat of a cutting torch. Inside, he could hear the frantic chirping of the Queelix and the low, steady voice of the Admiral, trying to organize a defense with a handful of medical droids and 2 wounded guards. "Lyra!" Powell yelled, slamming his shoulder into the door as it finally gave way. The room was a chaos of white light and blue sparks. A group of Ravagers, 4 armed Kovacs defectors and hulking, gray-skinned brutes, were pouring through a hole in the ceiling. One of them, a Ravager captain with a rusted cybernetic jaw, was leveling a thermal lance at the stasis unit where the Thorian berserker lay drugged. "Trophies!" the Ravager captain screamed in a distorted Kovacs dialect. "The Syndicate wants the beast. Kill the humans. Burn the soft shells." Varkas didn't think. He didn't calculate the odds. He saw the Ravager aiming at the creature he had spent 15 years preserving, the beast that was now part of this strange, messy pack. He raised his kinetic pistol and fired 4 rounds in rapid succession, 2 from his upper right arm, 2 from his lower left. The Ravager captain's head snapped back as the heavy slugs tore through his cybernetic jaw, sent him spinning into the medical consoles. "Varkas!" Admiral Solus shouted, his own pulse rifle barking as he took down a gray brute near the recovery beds. "What are you doing here?" "Saving your skin, Admiral," Varkas roared, leaping over a gurney to tackle a Ravager who was trying to reach Lyra's bed. "And protecting my property. That Thorian is mine to guard." The battle in the medbay was a blur of teeth, claws, and high-energy discharges. Varkas fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself. He used his 4 arms to grapple 2 enemies at once, his superior strength allowing him to snap the necks of Ravagers who had traded their souls for cheap cybernetics. He felt a searing pain in his shoulder. A plasma bolt had grazed his upper left arm, but he didn't stop. He pushed forward, standing over Lyra's bed like a living shield. She was awake now, her eyes wide and glowing with that strange, faint blue light. She was trying to sit up, her hand reaching for the Kovacs neural dampener on her temple. "Don't," Varkas growled, his voice a guttural rasp. "If you scream now, you'll melt your brain. Let the pack handle this." "Varkas," she whispered, her voice trembling. They have a null field generator on their ship. It's why our communications are down. You have to use the resonance." "I told you, it'll kill you." "Not me," she said, her fingers finding his hand. Her touch was cold, but her grip was like iron. Your skeletal structure, it's not as dense as a human's, but the Kovacs are natural resonators. I can bypass the dampener. I can use your bones as the antenna. We can broadcast a pulse that will short-circuit their null field for 5 seconds. Just 5 seconds. That's all my father needs to jump the fleet." Varkas looked at the Admiral, who was pinned down behind a stack of supply crates. He looked at Powell, who was bleeding from a dozen small wounds. He looked at the Quelix juvenile, huddled under a table, clutching a human teddy bear. This was the decision, the moment where the hunter had to become the sacrifice. If he let Lyra use him as a resonator, the feedback would be agonizing. It might even be fatal. "Do it," Varkas said, kneeling beside her bed. "But if I die, you tell that Admiral to give me a funeral with full honors. I want 60 ships firing a salute." Lyra smiled, a sad, beautiful thing. "You'll get 75, Captain. I promise." She reached out and touched the base of his skull, her fingers finding the neural junction. Varkas felt a sudden, sharp cold, and then the world exploded into a white-hot agony. It wasn't a scream this time. It was a roar that didn't come from Varkas's throat, but from his very marrow. As Lyra channeled the resonance through his body, Varkas felt every bone in his 4 arms, his rib cage, and his spine begin to vibrate at a frequency that defied the laws of physics. It felt as if his blood were boiling, as if his muscles were being stripped from his frame by 1,000 invisible knives. The world turned into a shimmering lattice of blue light and silver sound. He could feel the Ravager dreadnought outside. He could feel its null field, a suffocating blanket of static that was choking the Indomitable. And he could feel the connection Lyra had forged, a bridge of pure energy that turned him into a living lightning rod. "Now!" Lyra's voice echoed in his mind, though her lips didn't move. Varkas threw his head back and released the energy. A massive, invisible pulse of subharmonic frequency erupted from his body. It tore through the medbay, shattering the glass of the stasis units and sending the Ravagers reeling, their cybernetics sparking and failing as the resonance overloaded their neural links. The pulse didn't stop at the hull. It traveled through the vacuum, a ripple in reality that slammed into the Ravager dreadnought. For 5 glorious, agonizing seconds, the null field flickered and died. "Aegis Fleet, this is the Indomitable." Admiral Solus's voice boomed over the newly restored comms. "Execute Jump Point Omega. Strike the dreadnought's reactor. Fire everything." Outside, the darkness of space was suddenly filled with the brilliant white light of 100 Murphy drives. The human fleet, which had been circling the edge of the system, dropped out of probability space directly on top of the Ravager vessel. They didn't fire from a distance. They engaged at point-blank range, their railguns punching holes through the dreadnought's unshielded hull. A massive explosion blossomed in the void. a silent, expanding flower of fire and debris as the Ravager ship was torn apart molecule by molecule. Inside the medbay, the remaining Ravagers were being systematically neutralized by Powell and the Admiral. Without their cybernetic enhancements, they were no match for the professional fury of the Aegis Marines. Varkas collapsed to the floor, his forearms sprawling uselessly. The agony had faded into a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. He couldn't feel his fingers. He couldn't even feel his scales. Varkas! Shoo! Lyra's voice was the only thing keeping him from drifting into the black. He felt her hand on his chest, her touch warm this time. She was leaning over him, her own face streaked with tears and sweat. You did it. You broke the field. We're safe. Varkas tried to speak, but his throat was a desert. He managed a weak, rattling click of his mandibles. Don't try to move, a human medic said, appearing beside him with a scanner. You've got massive internal bruising, and your calcium levels are bottomed out. But you're alive, Captain. By some miracle, you're alive. Admiral Solis stepped over the body of a fallen Ravager and stood over Varkas. He looked down at the Kovacs hunter, his expression a complex mixture of respect, gratitude, and a lingering professional suspicion. He holstered his rifle and reached down, offering a hand to Varkas. Varkas looked at the hand, a human hand, soft skin, brittle bones, no natural armor. He reached out with his one working arm and took it. The Admiral pulled him up, supporting the Kovacs' massive weight as the medics moved in with a gurney. I suppose 75 ships would be the minimum, the Admiral said, his voice quiet. Though I'm thinking 100 would be more appropriate for a man who just saved a battle group. Save the fuel, Admiral, Varkas rasped, his voice returning in a painful whisper. Just give me a decent fermentation pod, and tell the sergeant to get his feet off my kinetic pistol. Powell chuckled, picking up the weapon and handing it back to Varkas. You're a piece of work, Captain, a real hull rat. I am Kovacs, Varkas said, his dignity returning even as he was loaded onto the gurney. And I have a reconstruction sentence to serve. I can't be dying in some messy human skirmish. As they wheeled him out of the medbay, Varkas saw the Quelix juvenile. The small creature had crawled out from under the table and was standing near the door. As Varkas passed, the juvenile made a soft clicking sound, a Quelix gesture of deep respect. It held out the human teddy bear, a small offering of comfort. Varkas looked at the toy, then at the child. He reached out a trembling claw and touched the bear's soft head. He realized then that the transformation wasn't just in the ships or the laws, it was in him. He had spent 40 years thinking that the universe was a place where you either held the leash or you wore the collar. He had thought that being alone was the only way to be safe. But as he looked at the humans, the Quelix, and even the sleeping Thorian berserker, he understood the real lesson of the scream. It wasn't a call for help. It was a declaration of existence. It was a way of saying, I am here, and because I am here, you are not alone. The humans had taken a death world and turned it into a cradle because they refused to let the darkness be silent. They had turned their own bodies into beacons because they knew that the light was only as strong as the people holding it. Admiral, Varkas called out just as the doors were closing. The Admiral turned. Yes, Captain. The Thorian, Varkas said. When he wakes up, don't put him back in the cage. He's a pack hunter. He needs a job. The Admiral smiled. We already have a position in mind for him. Security detail for a certain resident scout. Lyra waved at Varkas from her bed, her eyes bright with mischief. I'll make sure he doesn't eat your rations, Varkas, but you're still grounded until the tribunal. Varkas closed his eyes as the gurney entered the elevator. He was a prisoner. He was a criminal. He was a man with 60 years of hard labor ahead of him. But as the ship's engines hummed a steady, rhythmic song of home, Varkas didn't feel like a captive. He felt like a part of something massive, something unstoppable, something that had been hunting in the dark for 200,000 years and had finally found what it was looking for. He felt like a human, and in the silence of the elevator, for the first time in his life, Varkas didn't scream. He simply breathed, and the pack breathed with him. 2 days later, the Indomitable arrived at Station Omega-7. The station was a sprawling ring of light and steel, the primary hub for the Aegis Coalition in this sector. As the cruiser docked, Varkas was allowed to stand by the viewport in the security lounge. He watched as the survivors were unloaded. Hundreds of beings from a dozen different star systems, stepping out of the transports and into the arms of waiting families, medical teams, and diplomats. He saw the Quilix juvenile being reunited with a pair of elder Quilix, their chirping cries of joy echoing through the docking bay. He saw the Thorian berserker, now wearing a heavy specialized harness, walking calmly beside Sergeant Powell. The beast looked around the station with a wary but curious gaze, its tail twitching not in aggression, but in interest. And finally he saw Lyra. She was in a wheelchair, her legs still weak from the resonance, but she was surrounded by a dozen other scouts, young men and women who wore the same silver device on their temples. They were laughing, sharing data slates, and welcoming her back with a familiarity that made Varkas's heart ache with a strange, new kind of envy. "It's quite a sight, isn't it?" Varkas turned. Admiral Solus was standing beside him, his hands clasped behind his back. "It's a lot of noise," Varkas said, though there was no heat in the words. "It's the sound of a civilization, Captain," the Admiral said. "It's messy, it's expensive, and it's a logistical nightmare. But it's the only thing that keeps the Void from winning." The Admiral turned to Varkas. "Your trial starts tomorrow. The Qualix diplomats have already filed a petition on your behalf. They're asking for your sentence to be commuted to 5 years of supervised service on their homeworld, followed by a permanent position in the Interstellar Wildlife Protection Agency." Varkas blinked all 4 of his eyes. 5 years? Why? I kept their child in a box for 3 years. "They say you saved him twice," the Admiral said. "Once from the stasis mold and once from the Ravagers. They believe in restoration, Varkas, and they think you've already started." The Admiral reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic chip, a Kovacs data wafer. "We found this in your ship's wreckage. It's the recording Grix made for his hatchling. We've already sent it to Kovacs Prime. His family knows he died a hero, defending a Coalition scout." Varkas took the chip, his claws trembling. He looked at the Admiral, then back at the station. "You humans," Varkas said, his voice thick. "You're all mad. You rewrite the universe to fit your own stories." "We have to," the Admiral said, walking toward the door. "Otherwise, it's just a lot of cold rocks and empty space. Come on, Captain. The pack is waiting for us, and I believe you owe my daughter a very long apology." Varkas followed the Admiral out of the lounge and into the docking bay. As he stepped onto the station, the sounds of 1,000 voices hit him, a chaotic, beautiful symphony of life. He didn't cover his ears. He didn't look for a cage. He just walked into the noise, a hunter who had finally found a reason to stop running. The high tribunal chamber of Station Omega-7 was a place designed to make the individual feel like an insignificance floating in the center of a sun. Its ceiling was a vast dome of reinforced transparency, looking out into the swirling violet nebula of the fringe, while the walls were lined with the tiered seating of the Convergence representatives. 47 different species sat in that semicircle, a gallery of scales, fur, feathers, and synthetic carapaces, all of them silent, all of them judging. Varkas stood in the center of the pit, his 4 arms unbound but held at his sides in a posture of forced stillness. He was no longer wearing the orange-red dust of Oros 5 or the grease-stained jumpsuit of a hunter. He wore a simple gray tunic of a detainee, and without his weapons or his crew, he felt strangely naked. To his left, Tharn sat in a separate containment field, his scales a mottled, fearful gray. Tharn had been talking for 3 days straight, spilling every coordinate, every black market contact, and every secret Varkas had ever whispered in the dark, all in a desperate attempt to avoid the labor camps. The lead adjudicator was a member of the Vexturi, a spindly creature with 6 eyes and a voice that sounded like dry leaves skittering over stone. "Captain Varkas of the Kovacs," the adjudicator began, the words translated into a dozen dialects simultaneously. "You stand accused of 17 counts of illegal sentient trafficking, 43 counts of poaching in protected sectors, and the kidnapping of a high-level Aegis Coalition official. The evidence provided by the Aegis military and the survivors of your vessel is absolute. Do you contest these findings?" Varkas looked up at the tiers of alien faces. He saw the hatred in some, the clinical curiosity in others. He saw Admiral Solus sitting in the human delegation, his expression unreadable, his steel-gray hair catching the light of the nebula. "I do not contest them," Varkas said, his voice deep and steady. Tharn let out a sharp, panicked hiss from his cell. "He's lying!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "He forced us. We were just following orders. He's the one who wanted the human. He said she'd buy us a new ship. We're just hull jumpers, Your Honors. We just wanted to make a few marks." The Vexturi adjudicator turned 3 of its eyes toward Tharn. "Your testimony has been noted, Tharn. It has also been compared to the ship's internal logs, which show you participated in the capture with significant enthusiasm. Silence yourself." Tharn slumped back, his mandibles twitching with a frantic, silent terror. Varkas looked at the human delegation again. Lyra wasn't there. He felt a sharp pang of something like disappointment. He had wanted her to see this. He had wanted her to see that he wasn't running anymore. The trial proceeded with the clinical brutality of a ledger being settled. They called the witnesses. They showed the images of the trophy room. They played the audio of the screams. Hearing his own laughter echoing through the chamber, recorded by his own ship's sensors, felt like a physical blow to Varkas's chest. He remembered that moment on Oros 5. He remembered thinking how small and brittle the human had looked. He remembered the thrill of the chase. Now, listening to it in the presence of 47 species who live by the code of cooperation, he realized that he hadn't been an apex predator. He had been a scavenger, picking at the edges of a galaxy that was trying to heal itself. Then they called the final witness. A small reptilian creature stepped into the center of the pit. It was the Quelix juvenile. It looked tiny against the scale of the chamber, its 3 fingers clutching the edges of its ceremonial robe. Beside it stood a human medic, her hand resting gently on the child's shoulder. The adjudicator lowered its voice. "Little one, the child of Xylos, tell us of your time on the vessel known as the Carrion Claw." The child didn't speak at first. It turned its head, looking at the tiers of judges, and then its eyes found Varkas. Varkas expected the child to scream. He expected it to point a finger in accusation. Instead, the child made a series of soft, rhythmic clicks. The translator hummed. "I was in the dark," the child said. "I was a statue. I could see the hunter through the glass. Every day he came to my cage. He did not speak, but he brought the blue light that kept the mold away. He brushed my skin so the stasis would not itch. When the bad men with the metal jaws came, he stood in front of me. He was the shield. He was the resonance." The chamber fell into a profound silence. Even Tharn stopped his frantic whispering. The child stepped forward, away from the medic, and walked toward the edge of Varkas's designated area. "He is a hunter," the child clicked, "but he is not a ravager. He knows the pack." Varkas felt a lump in his throat that no amount of Kovac's pride could swallow. He looked down at the child, the tiny being he had kept in a box for 3 years, and realized that even in stasis, the child had been watching. It had seen the small, hidden acts of care that Varkas had performed when he thought no one was looking. The moments when his own loneliness had reached out to the loneliness of his trophies. The adjudicator's eyes shifted back to Varkas. "This is an unusual testimony, Captain. The Quelix people are not known for their forgiveness, and yet they have petitioned for a path of restoration rather than one of isolation. They believe you are a warrior whose path has been diverted, not destroyed." The Vexturi paused, leaning forward. "Before we pass judgment, do you have anything to say to this assembly?" Varkas took a deep breath. He looked at the child, then at the Admiral, then at the vast, uncaring stars beyond the dome. "I spent 40 years thinking the galaxy was a hunting ground," Varkas said, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "I thought strength was measured by how many things you could put in a cage. I thought that if you were soft, you were prey. I thought that if you were alone, you were safe." He paused, his mandibles working as he searched for the right words in a language that wasn't his own. "I was wrong. I met a girl who broke her own bones to call for help. I saw a fleet of 1,000 ships move through probability itself to save one life. I saw men and women who didn't even know each other die to protect a child that wasn't theirs. I realized that humanity's greatest weapon isn't their Murphy drive or their railguns. It's their refusal to let the dark win. It's their stubborn belief that no one, no matter how small, should have to scream alone." He looked at Tharn, who was shivering in the corner. Tharn is right about one thing. We were just following the traditions of our ancestors. But our ancestors lived in the dirt. We live among the stars now, and the stars are too cold to face without a pack. I accept whatever judgment this tribunal deems fit. I do not ask for mercy. I only ask for the chance to be a part of the reconstruction. I want to build something that doesn't need a cage. The Admiral stood up then, his presence commanding the room without a single word. He looked at Varkas for a long time, then nodded once, a sharp military gesture of acknowledgement. The tribunal adjourned for 3 hours. When they returned, the vexed jury adjudicator stood at the podium, its 6 eyes fixed on Varkas. Varkas of Kovacs, you are found guilty of all charges. Under the Galactic Convention, your crimes carry a sentence of 60 years of hard labor. However, in light of your actions during the Ravager assault and the petition of the Quelix survivors, we are offering you a suspended sentence. Varkas blinked, his forearms twitching in surprise. You will be remanded to the custody of the Xylos Reconstruction Authority, the adjudicator continued. You will spend the next 5 years on the Quelix homeworld, assisting in the restoration of the habitats destroyed by the Syndicate. You will work without pay, without rank, and under constant surveillance. If you complete this term with honor, the remainder of your sentence will be converted into a life term of service to the Interstellar Wildlife Protection Agency. You will never hunt again, Varkas, but you will spend the rest of your days ensuring that no one else does either. Varkas bowed his head, his forehead nearly touching the cold floor of the pit. It was more than he deserved. It was a life. As the guards let him out, he passed the Admiral. The human commander stopped him, placing a heavy hand on Varkas's shoulder. Don't make me regret this, Captain, Solus said. My daughter has a lot of faith in you. If you let her down, I won't send a fleet next time. I'll come myself. I won't let her down, Admiral, Varkas said. Where is she? The Admiral's expression softened slightly. She's on a transport to Earth. She needs 6 months of neural therapy to repair the damage from the resonance. But she left something for you. The Admiral handed Varkas a small, familiar object. It was the human teddy bear the Quelix juvenile had been holding. Attached to it was a small data tag. Varkas activated the tag. Lyra's voice filled his ears, clear and tinged with that familiar, sharp humor. Hey, Hull Rat, I heard the Quelix are giving you a job. Try not to eat the local wildlife, okay? It's bad for the reputation. And Varkas? Thanks for the bones. I'll see you in 5 years. Don't be late. Varkas gripped the small, soft toy in one of his massive claws. He walked out of the tribunal and toward the transport that would take him to Xylos Prime. He didn't feel like a prisoner being led to a cage. He felt like a scout being sent on a long, difficult mission. He looked up at the stars one last time before the airlock closed. They were still cold. They were still vast. But for the first time in his life, they didn't look empty. They looked like a home. The sun of Xylos Prime was a gentle golden orb that bathed the world in a light that felt like a warm embrace. It was a planet of floating islands, shimmering waterfalls that flowed upward toward the clouds, and forests of bioluminescent trees that sang in the wind. It was the complete opposite of the red, jagged wasteland of Oros 5. Varkas stood on the edge of a floating ridge, his forearms glistening with sweat as he hauled a massive beam of structural alloy into place. He had been here for 3 years, and the transformation of his body was as profound as the transformation of his soul. His scales were no longer the dull, metallic gray of a predator. They had taken on a deep, healthy bronze from the sun. His muscles were leaner, hardened by honest labor, rather than the explosive violence of the hunt. Beside him, a group of Quelix workers chirped and whistled, their small hands moving with incredible speed as they secured the beam to the foundation of the new nursery. They no longer flinched when he moved. They no longer looked at him as a monster. To them, he was simply Varkas, the big one who carried the heavy things. Good timing, Varkas, one of the Quelix clicked, its translator voice sounding cheerful. At this rate, we will have the roof on before the monsoon season begins. Varkas wiped his brow with a secondary arm. It's solid, Pip. That beam isn't going anywhere. Even if a Thorian decided to take a nap on it. A low, rumbling growl echoed from the shadows of the nearby grove. A massive white shape emerged, its fur white as a cloud and its eyes like glowing amber. The Thorian berserker walked toward Varkas, its heavy paws making no sound on the soft grass. It stopped beside him and nudged his shoulder with a head the size of a human torso. Varkas laughed, reaching out to scratch the beast behind its ears. "You're late for your shift, you lazy furball. Sergeant Powell is going to dock your rations." The Thorian huffed, a blast of warm air that smelled of mountain grass, and then settled onto its haunches, watching the construction with a protective gaze. The humans had been right. The beast didn't need a cage, it needed a pack. And on Xylos, it had found the largest, strangest pack in the galaxy. A shuttle drifted down from the upper clouds, its engines humming with the familiar, elegant song of an Aegis transport. It landed on the secondary pad, and Varkas felt a sudden, sharp flutter in his chest. He set down his tools and walked toward the landing zone, the Thorian following close behind. The hatch hissed open. A woman stepped out. She was walking on her own now, without a wheelchair or a cane. She wore the dark blue uniform of a master scout, and the silver device on her temple had been replaced by a small, unobtrusive sapphire stud. She looked healthy, her skin glowing, and her dark hair flowing freely in the breeze. Lyra Solis stopped at the bottom of the ramp and looked at him. She looked at the half-finished nursery, the chirping Quelix, and the massive berserker. She smiled, and it was the same smile that had challenged him in the trophy room of the Carrion Claw. "You're early, Varkas," she said. "I told you 5 years. It's only been 3 years and 8 months." "I like to be ahead of schedule, Lyra," Varkas said, his voice sounding more human than Kovacs. "It's a habit I picked up from a very annoying prisoner." She walked toward him, her steps confident. She stopped in front of him and reached out, her small hand resting on his massive bronze arm. "You look good, Varkas. The labor suits you." "It's a different kind of hunt," he said, gesturing to the nursery. "I'm still tracking things, but now I'm tracking the way the light hits the glass and the way the wind moves through the vents. It's harder than it looks." "I'm sure," she said. "My father sends his regards." He's retired now, spends most of his time on a porch in Florida, complaining that the ocean isn't blue enough and that the neighbors don't keep a tight enough formation. Varkas laughed. The image of the terrifying Admiral Solis arguing with a gardener was one he would treasure for a long time. "So," Lyra said, her expression turning serious, "my term as a field scout is over. The neural damage was more extensive than they told you. I can't do the heavy resonance anymore. I'm being assigned as a permanent liaison to the Wildlife Protection Agency." Varkas felt a surge of hope. "That's a good position." "It is," she agreed. "And I'm looking for a partner, someone who knows the fringe, someone who isn't afraid of the dark, someone who can handle a Thorian and a dozen angry Quelix. You know anyone like that?" Varkas looked at the berserker, who was currently letting a group of Quelix children climb on its back. He looked at the nursery, the home he was building for a species he had once tried to destroy. He looked at Lyra, the woman who had broken his world so that he could finally see the light. "I might know a guy," Varkas said, "but he's a bit rough around the edges, dressed like a hull rat and has a tendency to click his mandibles when he's annoyed." "I think I can manage him," Lyra said, her eyes twinkling. As they walked together toward the construction site, Varkas felt a profound sense of peace. The red dust of Oros 5 felt like a dream from a different life. The cages, the trophies, the credits, they were all ghosts now, echoes of a man who had been dead for a long time. He stopped for a moment and looked back at the shuttle, at the blue sky, and at the horizon where the floating islands danced in the sun. He thought about the journey he had taken, from the cold, lonely bridge of the Carrion Claw to the warm, crowded medbay of the Indomitable, and finally to this vibrant, singing world. "I spent 40 years in the void, and I thought I knew the weight of it. I thought the silence of space was the ultimate truth, and that we were all just echoes trying to outrun the inevitable hush. I carried my collection like armor, mounting those lives on my walls because I was afraid that if I didn't hold on to something, the darkness would simply swallow me whole. I lived by the law of the claw, believing that every connection was a tether that made you vulnerable, a weakness that could be cut. But standing here on Xylos with the sun on my scales and the sound of children laughing in the wind, I understand that I was looking at the galaxy through the wrong end of the lens. The void isn't a predator, and it isn't a grave. It's a canvas. We are the ones who decide what to paint on it. The humans didn't conquer the stars because they were strong. They conquered them because they were loud. They refused to let the silence be the final word. They taught me that the most powerful resonance in the universe isn't found in a machine or a bone lattice. It's found in the moment you realize that your heart is beating in time with someone else's. I am no longer a hunter. I am a builder. I am no longer alone. I am a part of the pack. And for the first time in my life, I don't need a cage to feel like I belong. Varkas looked at Lyra, who was watching him with a quiet, knowing expression. She didn't need a resonant scout's training to know what he was thinking. She was a human after all. They had a way of reading the soul that was more accurate than any scanner. "What are you thinking about, Captain?" she asked. "I was thinking about the scream," Varkas said. "On Oros 5. I thought it was the sound of defeat, but it was actually the sound of a beginning. It was the sound of 100 ships coming to tell me I was wrong." Lyra leaned against his arm, her head resting against his bronze scales. "We're a noisy species, Varkas. We don't know how to go quietly." "I noticed," Varkas said, his mandibles clicking in a gesture of deep, abiding affection. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the valley, Varkas turned toward the audience of the stars, those millions of tiny lights that had once been his hunting ground. He looked at them not as targets, but as neighbors. "I spent my life thinking that if you were soft, you were weak. I thought that if you cried out for help, you had already lost. But I saw a whole civilization move heaven and earth for one single fragile life. I wonder, in your own world, in your own life, do you have that person? Do you have that one connection that would bring 1,000 ships to your side if you called? And more importantly, would you be that ship for someone else? Would you move the stars for a single scream in the dark?" Varkas turned back to the nursery, picking up his tools with a steady hand. The work was far from over. There were more beams to haul, more habitats to build, and a whole galaxy of broken things that needed to be mended. He didn't mind. He had time, he had a pack, and he had finally learned how to listen to the song. The Thorian berserker let out a soft, contented rumble as the first stars appeared. Varkas reached out and took Lyra's hand, his massive claws careful and gentle, as they walked home together through the singing woods. A single white flower native to the floating islands drifted down from the canopy and landed on Varkas's shoulder, a tiny speck of life against the bronze armor of his skin. He didn't brush it away. He simply carried it with him into the light.